evaluation report. Now, fast forwarding to 2021-2022, with the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Support, the Coalition for Transparency and Accountability in Education has conducted a research piece to provide a sort of update on the implementation on the LEAP, this PPP in education ongoing in Liberia from a human rights, a right to education perspective. So key findings and recommendations of this recent research will be discussed today. You should also know that the report will be published early next year. This, together with the findings and recommendations of the CGDEV independent evaluation report, will feed into the general discussion. It will also be the occasion to get the perspective of other actors in education, including CSOs on other PPPs in education in West Africa. So feel free to, if you have some questions, to leave them in the chat. Then those questions are going to be asked when the Q&A session is going to unfold. So the order of panelist intervention will be as follows. I'll start with laying the human legal ground regarding what the Abidjan Principle says when states have to fund private actors involved in education, and for the purpose of this discussion, in public-private partnerships in education. So I will share with you the relevant provisions contained in the Abidjan Principles regarding private involvement in education. And also I will be followed by Anderson Miama, who is the National Coordinator of the Coalition for Transparency and Accountability in Education in Liberia, and he will present the key findings and recommendations of the research on LEAP as at today. Thereafter, Justin Sanderfield, Co-Director and Education Policy and Senior Fellow from the Center for Global Development, who is also the author of the two independent evaluation reports on LEAP, will provide remarks on the lessons learned from the evaluation on LEAP. Then Ms. Veronica Giagu, Education Policy Analyst, former National Coordinator of the Ghana Education Coalition Campaign, will provide an overview of GALLOP and the response to it from a civil society perspective. There will be a Q&A session spanning over 25 minutes, and you have the opportunity to ask questions. So feel free to either write your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, or you can simply raise your hands. And of course, you'll be given the floor to speak. And finally, we will conclude. So without any further ado, I will start by presenting the relevant Abidjan Principles provision regarding financing of private education. So let me share my screen. No. Hold on a minute. Okay. So I'll share my screen now. Okay. So let me know if you see my screen. So what are the Abidjan Principles? The Abidjan Principles are a set of different provisions that regards the right to education that are contained in human rights instruments that have been ratified by states. So they compile and elaborate on these set of provisions. And these are not, it's not a new law, it's not a new legal text. It rather compiles and elaborates on existing laws. So it's a practical tool that provides concrete guidance to states regarding the obligations to not only provide public education, but to also regulate private involvement in education. They were adopted in 2019 in Cote d'Ivoire, and they contain 10 overarching principles and 97 guiding principles. So the principles we are looking at regarding financing of private actors in education, and for the purpose of this discussion regarding PPPs, are overarching principle 5 and guiding principles 64 to 73. So I will share these principles with you so that you also get to see what the Abidjan principles look like. So I'll stop to share my screen just for a moment, and I'll share my screen again. So here I am. So let me share my screen again. Here it is. Okay. So one thing you should know, one thing that is interesting regarding the requirements that states should look into before providing financing or funding to private instructional education institutions is that they have to look at substantive requirements, they have to look at procedural requirements and operational requirements. So this is what we stand for. Education is a public good. So the rule is that education should be public, free, and it should be quality. But in case education is provided by private actors because of a certain gap on part of the state, there are requirements that states should look into when funding those private actors. So first thing to note is that before a state decide to fund some private actors, such funding should be time bound. It should be a time bound measure. So there should be a limitation in terms of time frame. Secondly, it should not create a foreseeable risk of adverse effects or delay the most effective and expeditious possible development of a free public education system, because remember, the rule or the principle is for education to be free and public and quality. Such funding should not lead to a diversion of public resources that will constitute an impermissible retrogressive measure. It should not constitute or contribute to the commercialization of education system, because education is not supposed to be a commodity. It should not create a foreseeable risk that the funded private instructional education institution could exercise an undue influence on the education system, and it should not create a foreseeable risk of any other systemic impact on the right to education. After looking into substantive requirements, the state should look at procedural requirements before they decide to fund a private educational institution, and especially in the framework of a public-private partnership. So in terms of procedural requirements, before funding is considered, we have to ensure, or states should ensure, that the funding is before it is determined, there is a participatory, inclusive, transparent, and accountable consultation process. And the effective participation of all stakeholders, including children and learners, parents and other legal guardians, communities, teaching and non-teaching staff, education unions, and other civil society organizations. States should publicly demonstrate that such public funding meets all the substantive, procedural, and other requirements, and the states should assess and publicly demonstrate its capacity and intent to continuously monitor and regulate the private instructional educational institution ability to meet the applicable standards. The process of allocating funding should be transparent and not discriminatory. And the funding should be set up in such a way that it is possible in practice to reverse it. Now, in terms of operational requirements that should be met before the state fund a private educational institution, The standards and regulations applying to that institution must impose at least the same educational, labor, and other relevant standards that are imposed on public educational institutions. States should also take all effective measures to overcome the inability to deliver or manage any aspect of the provision of private education services which justified funding of a private institution. Any funding of an eligible private instructional educational institution must be subject to ex ante, ongoing, and ex post human rights assessment. States should make the continued provision of funding conditional on fulfillment of the required standards and ensure that all contracts permit the state to withdraw from the funding without prejudice. So also, the cost of human rights impacts assessment and other requirements on the state should be considered as part of the evaluation of the cost of the arrangement for funding. States should also ensure that all private instructional educational institutions receiving public funding make all proprietary data and material that could help to improve education system available without a license. Now, states should also look at institutions that are ineligible so that they don't provide them funds or support. So institutions, for example, that abuses the right to equality and non-discrimination, including by being selective or expelling or sorting learners, in institutions that are commercial and excessively pursue their own self-interest, because let's again remember that education is not a commodity. Institutions that charges fees in such a way that it undermines the right to education and access to education. Institutions that do not meet any minimum standard applicable to private instructional educational institutions. Institutions that do not comply with all of their domestic and international financial obligations, or institutions that contribute to an adverse systemic impact on enjoyment on the right to education or any other human rights in any other way. So given the time constraint, these are the different requirements that states should look into when considering to fund a private institution involved in education. So I'll stop here. Let me stop sharing my screen, and I'll give the floor to Anderson so that he presents the key findings and recommendations of the recent research on LEAP. Over to you, Anderson. Anderson?
Thank you, Ayad. Welcome to everyone. I'm glad to be here. As you indicated, let me put my video on. And I think I can also share my screen. Uh,
Anderson, I don't think you are sharing the right screen. Yeah, that's good now. You just removed your presentation, Anderson. Thank you, Anderson. You can go ahead now. And you can unmute yourself. Yeah, you are muted.
Hello?
Yes, Anderson, we can hear you, but you are, yeah, good. Yeah, it's perfect now. You can
Oh,
go ahead.
okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry for that. I've already taken some of my time, so let me just go straight to my presentation. I'm Anderson from Liberia. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be a part of this research and this roundtable to present findings of the work we've been doing over the last few months. So, there are a few things that we will be looking at in terms of outline of the presentation. We will look at those behind the research, a brief background of the LEAP or the Liberia Education Advancement Program. What are we monitoring the program or education? The how did we do the work? Key transparency concerns. Then key transparency concerns now, the key findings from the research now, and key recommendations. In terms of the background, I have provided some information earlier about LEAP. I will just give a little bit more about it. As you may be aware, LEAP, which is the Liberia Education Advancement Program, was once called Partnership School for Liberia. That's when the program was introduced during the 2016-2017 school year in Liberia. It began with a pilot of 93 public primary schools. Bridge International Academies, which is BIA, was the loan provider at the time when the government initiated the program, but seven other providers were included based on pressure from civil society and other stakeholders. The program was heavily criticized at the time and still remains criticized, and is likely the most controversial program in the history of education in Liberia, especially public education. 525 schools are now under the program, with BIA having up to 350% of those schools, which constitutes 70%. It should be 70% actually. BIA is the biggest and the most dominant in the dominant provider under the program. In terms of those behind the research, this work is funded by the Open Society Foundation through the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It was conducted by the Coalition for Transparency and Accountability in Education, which is COTAE, which is headed by the Center for Transparency and Accountability in Liberia. In Liberia, and CENTAI is the national chapter of Transparency International. So it is a collaborative effort of COTAE, CENTAI, and a global initiative for economic, social, and cultural rights. In terms of how we did the work, so this work is mainly qualitative. The research, in terms of the approach, is mainly qualitative. The field work was done between March and May of this year, 2022. We did media tracking or monitoring. We followed up on a lot of things that were reported in the media about education in Liberia, LEAP, and the activities of British International Academies in Liberia. We reviewed published reports and leaked documents. We're seeing leaked documents because, as you will know, along the way, transparency and accountability has been very limited around the LEAP program. So some of the information we got them through sources on those disclosed sources, people confiding in us, and some of those things are included in the report, as you will see when we move along. In terms of the interview aspect of the work, we visited several schools and communities, actually in 4 counties. They're not listed here, but we visited Monserrado, which hosts the capital city of Liberia. Bomi County is in western Liberia. Bon County is in central Liberia, and Grand Bassa County. So 4 counties we covered with the field work. In terms of those we targeted, 81 persons targeted throughout the study, 25 females and 57 males. And these people included teachers, parents, local and national education leaders, civil society, and some of the lead partners. And then, of course, we followed up on the different issues that came up so that we get much more evidence that we can include in a report. In terms of why we did the monitoring, we had to do this work so that we promote continuous independent monitoring and reporting on education-related activities in Liberia, especially so the Liberia Education Advancement Program. We also did this work so that we share key lessons and experiences with others, just as we're doing now, and we hope to do after launch of the report early next year. We did this also to carry out evidence-based advocacy so that we promote inclusion and transparency in education, especially around the LEAP program, to promote and defend the right to education, to push for effective regulation of the involvement of private actors in education in Liberia and beyond. When this is a follow-up research, as I had told you earlier, we did the first research in 2017 and found out lots of things, some of which are included here. So when we did a research in 2017, one of the things we found out was that there was violation of the public procurement law and guidelines. British International Academies was handpicked by the government of Liberia from the beginning. After pressure from civil society and other players, 7 other providers were introduced in the program. One of the things we also found out was that stakeholders consultation was very limited. Civil society was not engaged constructively and meaningfully, and even other players in education, local education officials were not consulted, as well as other players at the national level. We also found out that the program documents were not publicly available and accessible. We had to go through a lot to get some of the information and documents we obtained at the time to inform the report and the other advocacy efforts we carried out. British International Academies pushed away students due to class cap they introduced. In most of the schools, they have up to 45, at most 50 students. And in Liberia, we have schools that have up to 75, 60, 75, and even 80 students. So that class cap they introduced pushed away a lot of students that ended up not going to school at the time, violating then their right to education. Financial transparency was very limited. Information around what Bridge and the other providers generated and expended on the program was not really reported on. There's no other report up to the time we did the research that was published that shows clearly what came in and how the resources were expended. Many verbal promises were made to schools and communities at the time. For example, free uniform provision or free uniform. There was discussion also talk of giving tablets to each student and meal. But many of these things were not realized based on interaction with parents and other stakeholders at the time. In terms of the new research and what we've found out, many of the things that we saw in 2017 still remain. So nothing, not much has really changed in terms of the SSAs of British International Academies and the other players on the program. I like to say that there are 7 providers under the program, but this research focuses on British International Academies mainly because, like I said, they are the dominant provider under the program. Of the 500 plus schools, they are running up to 350 of those schools. So that's up to 70% of the schools under the program. So lack of evidence-based expansion of the program This is something that has come up in this research. When the program was introduced in 2017, the government said it was a pilot and that based on evidence that it would have been scaled up. Even before the research was conducted by Mr. Standerfoot and his team, the government had already made a decision to scale up the program. Since then, successive scale-up decisions have not really been based on evidence. We also found out that there's still limited stakeholders consultation and participation in expansion and other key decisions. As I sit here, I represent an organization that is one of the leading civil society institutions in the education space in Liberia. We are represented at the very highest level in terms of decision-making in education. The same way other programs, traditionally funded programs, are exposed and open to stakeholders in terms of inputs. That is not the case with the LEAP program. So decision making around the LEAP program or LEAP has been very translucent. It hasn't been transparent, and this is a concern that we saw in 2016, 2017, and it remains at the moment. We also realized that the program documents are still not available to get the MOU that the government signed with Bridge and the other players is very difficult. It's not published on the Ministry of Education's website, neither available at the local level that you can access to really go through and see very clearly what these providers are able to do. Even though you can struggle, you find a way to get some of the documents and information, but it should not be that way. They should be available because these providers are in public schools and what they are doing is supposed to be public. We also realized that financial transparency is still very, very limited. There is secrecy in terms of the finances of the providers, especially British international economies. How much they're raising, what they're using on the school system in Liberia is not really clear. You get this a lot when you talk to even the schools, the very schools that they operate in. The administrative of these schools, the parents and the communities do not really have information on what Bridge is actually supposed to do. So there's no written documentation that they can point to. Everything they know about the program is verbal. So this is a concern that we saw then, and it remains as part of the things that is happening under the program. We also saw conflict of interest involving national players and decision makers around the program. By this conflict of interest, we mean that some of the players who are supposed to independently oversee the lead program and be independent player when it comes to overseeing the work of the 7 providers. There are just 8 providers rather. There are just 4 of them under the program at the moment, by the way. 4 of those providers have dropped off due to funding and other concerns. But coming back one of the key pressing or the proponents behind the program was the then deputy minister of research and the head of education delivery unit at the Ministry of Education. He along with former minister Warner and the rest engineered introduction of the LEAP program in Liberia. Just recently he moved on to becoming the country director of British International Economists. But that's just not the point. When he was still head of the education delivery unit, he co-authored one of the reports that BIA produced that is, of course, very favorable to British and does not really contain some of the issues that we have reflected in this document. So the point here is to be presiding over a process that is supposed to supervise 8 providers, and you are seeing co-authoring a report for one of the providers. It then says a lot in terms of your independence and the extent to which you can make very independent decisions. But then not just that, we saw a few months later, he moved on to becoming the head and country director of British International Economists in Liberia. One of the things that we've also found out is the fact that much of the information available to parents, school authorities, and teachers are verbal. So Bridge does not really have very clear information in terms of documentation. From all of the schools we visited, there's not a sheet, one piece of document that people can reference to say, this is what we have that says very clearly, this is the MOU, between British international academies and our school, and very clearly outlining the things that they are supposed to do and not do. So, for example, the promise of free meal at a time, uniform, tablet for students, and all the different things have not really been actualized. Even though for the uniform aspect of it, during the initial the initial aspect of the program, Bridge provided uniform, one set of uniform to schools, but for now, uniforms are not being provided. What we're told based on the research is that the Ministry of or the Government of Liberia has a policy for Bridge to abolish the distribution of uniforms to schools. But then the concern from the parents is that the resources that were being used to procure these uniforms could be used for other purposes that would benefit them. But as it is, they have no very clear information on where those resources have been redirected. There's also bad labor practice. We saw that's this one of the major things we saw under the research, especially with British international academies. So during the COVID-19 period, for example, British introduced a policy, wrote a letter or communication to many of his staff talking about 90% pay cut that was countered by the teachers or the staffers under review. They took that to the Ministry of Labor and the legislature. They intervened, and that decision was overturned. There was also illegal dismissal of some staff, especially so a very key staff that took the matter to the Ministry of Labor. They had to rule against breach, and information we gathered is that breach ended up paying up to 20,000 USD to that staff that was dismissed illegally based on the mandate from the Ministry of Education, or the not Ministry of Education, but the Ministry of Labor. There has also been concerns around poor treatment of teachers. Teachers in breach-run schools stay far longer than their counterparts in other schools, but these teachers do not receive extra staffing or benefits, so to speak. Apart from that, volunteer teachers under the bridge program have complained that the staffing or compensation that they are promised, especially those who are not on government payroll, that pay doesn't really come. And also, Bridge has a policy that if you don't teach up to 80%, you cannot receive that staffing. So to see that as an issue, along with several other issues that are reported, details of which are in a report that we'll share with you subsequently. The last point we noted here is that there's lack of respect for constitutional authorities, meaning by BIA. So BIA has been violating Liberian laws since they came in country, and they've also been disrespecting constitutional authorities. So during the case involving the situation involving reduction of staff salary, dismissal of staff, and all the other issues, the parliament here in Liberia invited the leadership of British international academies. On several occasions, they failed to appear. And at some point when they appeared, members of parliament expressed disappointment in the conduct of the leadership of British, and most of the arbitrary decisions that were making that they were taking in terms of undermining or disrespecting or violating the rights of workers. There were also instances where the police invited some officials of Bridge, and they refused to appear on 2 or 3 occasions before making appearances. So these are some of the major issues we found, and the last two are sustainability concern. We've also realized that funding has been a challenge. Even BIA has been struggling to mobilize resources for its operation in Liberia. Eight providers started the program in 2016, 2017. At the moment, we have only 4 of those providers under the program. And when we talk to the lead providers, especially those who have exited the program, one of the major reasons they cited was funding constraint. They could not mobilize resources to sustain their stay in the schools under the program. And sadly, also, it's important to note that many of them abruptly exited those schools. So many of the schools had to struggle, to reconnect because of the abrupt nature of the departure of the providers that was once providing some sort of support to them in terms of running of those schools. It's also reported based on all of the engagements we've had that the state of many of the schools that we visited that are run by Bridge are very poor. By poor we mean we saw very leaking roofs. In some of the places, we saw classrooms that didn't have chairs. Although we must indicate here that many of the public schools in Liberia, the seating capacity or the environment is not very conducive. But with the resources that Bridge and the other providers are mobilizing, one would think that the schools they run would be better off than the rest of the public schools, especially so that, again, like we said, transparency, accountability has been an issue. There's been not much in terms of information out there on the resources that they are mobilizing. So to have schools under their watch in poor state is concerning, and parents, school authorities, and students have been complaining about these things, and we found that out doing the research as well. In terms of recommendations, there is a need for increased transparency and accountability around the program. This is extremely important as we move forward, not just the program, but in education generally. There's also a need to ensure active and greater CSO and citizens' involvement with the program and other education-related activities. Like I said earlier, unlike all the other traditional programs in education, this is the program that has very limited stakeholders involvement, especially civil society. Access to key documents is very limited, and this is extremely concerning for a program as big as LEAP, that has four providers at the moment, and Bridge that is mobilizing a lot of resources, but then not accounting to the public and stakeholders about what they are getting actually. There is also a need to ensure effective and independent oversight of the program. Actors who are supposed to oversee the activities of Bridge, the other lead providers, and different programs in education should be independent of these institutions. If you have a link, to a provider, maybe Bridge and any of the other providers that you are supposed to supervise, then it compromises your independence in the process, which doesn't augur well for transparency and accountability in the sector. There is a need for documents related to LEAP to be made public. The Ministry of Education has a website. They should provide these different pieces of information to the public so that stakeholders can have them, go through them, get informed, and make constructive constructively engage with these programs and make informed decisions. There is also a need for the government of Liberia to hold Bridge accountable for the many violations it has been carried out over the period, especially so those ones that I talked about earlier, including illegal dismissal of staff, reduction of staff salary, and disrespecting constituted authorities. There is a need also for civil society organizations to continue or increase independent monitoring of LEAP and other programs in education. This is important. We have to do that as civil society, build citizens' capacity so that they engage with these processes more constructively, so that independent information comes out on these programs and activities. There is a need for government to increase investment in public education to at least 20% so that the public sector or the public schools have the resources required to deliver quality, inclusive, and lifelong education to the public. Lastly, government should develop a plan to phase out leave and transfer the schools back to an accountable public system. This is extremely important. We found out sustainability concerns. Like I said, four providers at a time, eight providers at a time, only four are in a program at the moment. We don't know what might happen as we move on. This is a key concern. We cannot rely on external support largely to introduce a program that may be problematic along the way if the partners withdraw support. Bridge itself has been struggling to mobilize resources. Other providers have been struggling. Four out of eight remaining under the program, and we believe that the schools have to go back to the public school system, the core public school system or the management. And the way to do that is to have a phase-out approach so that gradually we transition the schools to the public school system and local management. Thank you so much. I will stop here. Thank you for the opportunity, and I will entertain questions as we move forward to explain a lot more about some of the other things that we could not highlight in a few slides we've presented here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anderson. I'll now give the floor to Justin.
Great, thanks a lot, Aya. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Let me see if I can share my screen. 1 second. Working? Excellent. All right. I think Anderson covered a lot of, the description of the program and a lot of what I would say in terms of general lessons. So let me try to walk through here briefly the independent evaluation that I referred to. And I'm going to just kind of jump to the end, focus on the year 3 evaluation, and encompasses a lot of the stuff that was in the year 1 evaluation as well. This is together with my colleague Mauricio Romero at ETOM in Mexico City. And round 1 was with Wayne Sandholtz as well, who's now in Lisbon. So yeah, let's dive right in. I'm going to talk about, why we did this, and then kind of the evaluation design, what we did, and then run through the results in terms of what we saw from partnership schools, LEAP, in terms of learning outcomes, access to schooling, the sort of financial sustainability of the program, and the safety considerations, which came up as a major theme, given kind of the horrible things that many of you will have heard about with More Than Me, one of the operators. The questions that Aya posed to me when we chatted before this panel were listed here: motivation for the study, our recommendations after the first round, were any of those incorporated, findings after our second round, and the recommendations now. I'm not sure if I'll have good answers for the last one, but I'm going to try to kind of weave responses to those through as we go through the description of the evaluation. But for an international audience, the program needs to know motivation, I think, for the Liberian audience. For the international audience, I think the world was sort of watching Liberia as it undertook this sort of radical experiment of saying our school system, our basic education system is underperforming. We're going to do something radical to mix it up and turn to outside private providers to take over public schools. Cover story of a weekend feature in the Financial Times. There were multiple stories in the Economist. Multiple op-eds in the New York Times, and my favorite headline from Vox: Liberia is outsourcing primary schools to a startup backed by Mark Zuckerberg. I think it was when the reporter called me for that story was the first time I got involved with this program. So Anderson already described what LEAP / partnership schools were, but important for the purposes of this, everything that I'm going to say, the data we have, comes from the original sample of 93 schools, and then control schools, that didn't participate, regular Liberian government schools that didn't participate in the program that we use as comparators. Later, the program expanded beyond the 93, but the focus here is going to be on those 93 original partnership schools. The idea is that they would be free to students. They should be non-selective, that they would still be staffed by teachers on government payroll, which is sort of unusual for a public-private partnership like this, but that the management of the schools would be handed over to 8 private contractors who would get, in principle, $50 per pupil subsidy. Now, I think, one of the big lessons here, a couple of the big lessons I think that other countries watching, and even the ministry in Liberia reflecting on the way forward, is that this funding model, at the end of the day, there was not much by way of centralized funding. And what you ended up with was individual funders kind of backing individual school chains, which sort of took away the ability to have real accountability, right? Instead of the government holding the purse strings and saying, we'll extend your contract or expand the number of schools you have based on your performance, they didn't really have that power, because individual donors would say, hey, we really like Bridge International Academies, or we like so-and-so, and they need more schools. Or you need to overlook sort of their failures. And so I think fundamentally, that lack of accountability from the donors was something that there was very little in terms of program design that I think the Ministry of Education could do to fix that basic power dynamic with the donors here. But I think with help from some technical assistance, the ministry did push back to the extent of insisting, backtrack and said, okay, we're not going to do this with just one company. There were, as Anderson mentioned, 8 original providers. And I think it's important when we talk about this program, we have lots to say about Bridge, and there's lots that should be said about, post-mortem on the More Than Me, kind of scandals. And then there are more diverse experiences from other operators like Street Child and BRAC and YMCA that, that had very different experiences. It's worth, I think, recognizing that diversity of outcomes in the program. The design, I won't pause here long. We collected a bunch of data on schools, teachers, observing the classrooms and so on. But the basic design of the evaluation was to say, let's start off with 185 schools that the ministry has said are eligible for the program, and then randomly assign half of those to become partnership schools. So the original cohort of partnership schools were randomly assigned to participate, so that we can say we really have comparable schools that are going to be regular control schools, continue operating as government schools, and then the partnership schools. And we're going to track over 3 years, the students who were originally, before the program even started, the students who were originally in those schools will track those students for 3 years. No matter what happens, if they get kicked out, if they drop out, if they stay home, or if they stay in the school, or if they transfer to a new school, we'll still track them. And kudos to our tracking teams from IPA, Innovations for Poverty Action, and Mr. Dactolo, who's still doing this kind of research there in Monrovia, who had the job of, like, even if a student went back or to live with their aunt and uncle in a different village, they track them down and see how they're doing. I've said all that. We collected the first round after the first year of the program, and then came in for the final round after the 3rd year of the program. So learning outcomes. The motivation here was clear. If you look at literacy rates after 5 years of schooling from the demographic and health surveys, internationally, Liberia kind of started off at the bottom of the pack. These are for adult women, with 5 years of schooling in Liberia. This data is several years old now, but it's only achieving like 10% literacy rates even after several years of schooling. And so there was real need, obviously, for a change. What we saw in partnership schools, or LEAP, is that they were, when these teams kind of showed up to randomly visit, they were more likely to be in session, and have more, they spent more hours, more hours of instruction, so the management did do something to improve kind of the quantity of teaching that was delivered. LEAP teachers were more likely to be, were not more likely to be in school, but the quality of instruction was higher from what we observed in the classroom observations. More time spent on instruction and less time off task, with just kind of chaos in the classroom. So some improvements there overall across all the operators from the classroom observations. Test scores is what people, I think, tend to fixate on. And the impact, by comparing the treatment versus control schools, we can say that the learning gains, were about overall about 0.2, little under 0.2 standard deviations in both English and math. Now, standard deviations, for a lay audience is kind of tough to process sometimes. And it's important to think about what a standard deviation means in the Liberian context. Well, actually, before I say that, I should say that was after year 1. When we came back after year 3, kind of hoping to see kind of a linear improvement with the partnership schools pulling away from regular government schools, we really didn't see that. What we saw was sort of the same effect. They were still ahead, but basically by the same amount. And so a leveling off in terms of the gains that the partnership schools saw. Putting that in more real terms, though, a standard deviation doesn't, 0.2 standard deviations in the Liberian context is a relatively small amount. You're talking about something like 2 to 4 words per minute in terms of the reading fluency of the students. So, not if you're talking about trying to get up to sort of rich world standards, which for early grades, you'd want, up periods, for fluent, you'd want them reading at 65 words, per minute. You're moving the needle here by a relatively modest amount through this program, to be frank. There were differences, as I said, though, even on learning across the providers, with some like Stella Maris in the South, in Maryland, who really didn't turn up and do anything. Omega, which had sort of, not so stellar performance on learning gains, and BRAC as well. And then a bunch of the others from Street Child, Bridge, Youth Movement for Change, More Than Me, and Rising, with fairly similar kind of 0.4-ish standard deviation learning gains. Still small in absolute terms, but statistically significant and meaningful. On access, this is where things start to get a little bit more controversial. Coming into the program, obviously a low enrollment problem and really a backlog of students. What you see in Liberia is fairly unique with, the blue is like kids in primary school here by age. And so you have lots of, 16, 17, 18-year-olds at the time the study started still in primary education. And so it's an important piece of context, how were the schools going to deal with that? After 3 years, what we see is that LEAP did reduce the share of students, the original students still in school. So the control is the blue bars, the LEAP schools are the orange bars. And overall, you do see this tendency towards, it's looks kind of small there, as we'll see as we zoom in. It gets to be a meaningful amount, kind of an increase in dropout and kids no longer in school as a result of the program. And as you zoom in across the operators, you do see, in line with the stuff that Anderson mentioned, that this really is sort of a bridge and to some extent Omega phenomenon that had to do with these capping of class sizes and expulsion of kids en masse. And beyond, we see that beyond that, though, I think there might be a slide coming, I guess there's not, that there is, even beyond those initial expulsions, just a dropout problem in the bridge schools. That bridge showing up and taking over your primary school is going to reduce the number of kids who transition into secondary school and increase the number of kids who dropped out. And this is something, back to things that we flagged early in around round one, where we saw these expulsions and we saw these class size caps, and we say, look, the program's reducing access to schooling. And there just wasn't an appetite from the ministry or from the donors at that point to do anything about that. People, I think, were really fixated on, we need to improve these learning outcomes. We need to post and show that this model can work. Let's focus on the test scores, and kind of deliberately, I think, tuned out this problem of reducing access to schooling. Sustainability on costs, getting back to the financial model of the program, which was really the unresolved kind of original sin here. The promise to the operators was a subsidy of $50 per pupil. They kind of self-reported their budgets. And you can see some of the operators like Street Child managed to operate on that amount of money, and even less, as those subsidies didn't always come in. Same with Omega. BRAC did fairly well, even YMCA at keeping close to that budget. But some of the others that had more international connections were operating at several fold that scale, with the incredible bars being here for Bridge, which was spending closer to like nearly $700 per student in the first year. That came down, but remained, at multiples of what the government is able to spend on schools. So you have to think of their performance as, these are really well-funded schools by Liberian standards. And that had to do with, those companies being able to raise money from private philanthropies who weren't so much interested in funding the system as a whole, but in funding those operators. Safety is, obviously the elephant in the room for this program. Most of you will know about, the scandals involving, the sexual abuse of girls in More Than Me schools, sexual abuse that occurred before LEAP and PSL began, but I think wasn't fully accounted for and recognized by everybody involved when the program started. And so really made the decision to entrust more schools and more students into the hand of this organization, I think, really questionable. And so clearly there's a lesson there about better due diligence, about the track record in terms of safety and child protection of partners in a program like this before handing them, access to more students in more schools. In the third round, in the year 3, in the final round of the evaluation, we added modules on safety, both corporal punishment and sexual violence. Surveys asked students whether the teacher ever hit students. In the control group, 49% say never, so half say that it happens sometimes. And that goes up by about 4 to 5%. So the number saying never goes up in LEAP schools. There's a small reduction in corporal punishment in LEAP schools, so that's good. On sexual violence, some work together with Laura Johnson for the Rutgers School of Social Work and Wayne Sandholz. We did introduce this module on sexual violence. Let me just jump to those results. I think the sad news there is that, we do find, a minority, but a small but significant number of students in these schools reporting being inappropriately touched, having sex with a teacher, having forced sex with another student. And despite these partnership schools being super well resourced, with external management to improve what's going on in the school, we just didn't see them making any progress on reducing that phenomenon. So no treatment effect overall on the levels of sexual violence in the schools. So the conclusions, I've just put them up here to summarize across the different operators. I think the conclusions vary a lot across operators. I think if I from some operators, like I'll focus on Street Child, who produced decent learning gains, had sort of a neutral effect on access, neutral effect on safety, and managed to operate at a really sustainable cost levels. I think you'd have a more positive impression of this program. I think if you focus on some of the others, Bridge obviously being the controversial one, Bridge stroke New Globe now, which was really kind of deliberately reducing access to schooling, then you're confronted with real trade-offs between, yes, they produce learning gains, but they also reduced access to schooling, and the costs, if you wanted to do this long-term, are sort of unsustainable. I think, the big takeaway, those were our recommendations from year 1. It was like, look, you need to hold operators accountable for more than just these test scores. Some of these access things are a problem. And if you want that kind of accountability, you need to have centralized funding with the power to do that. That's something that I think still hasn't happened. As funding got tight, the government was in no position sort of to do that. And so that remains a problem today. And I think that's the main lesson for PPPs, about having centralized funding, having competition among more than one operator, and having real monitoring and accountability systems, not just for test scores, but for some of these other dimensions, including child protection, safety, and access to schooling as well. All right, let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. So normally, Veronica is supposed to be the next speaker. Unfortunately, she's having serious technical glitches that make her almost impossible to join. However, we do have a presentation that we'll share with everyone after the webinar. So we'll have to move straight, unfortunately, we'll have to move straight to the Q&A session, and we already have some questions in the Q&A box. So yeah, you can keep them coming. So I'll start reading out the questions, and the speakers can answer them. So the first one, how did the closing of secondary schools by Bridge affect the dropout numbers? Were students dropping out, or was there nowhere for them to go? So who will feel more comfortable to answer this question, either Justin or Anderson?
I can start, and maybe he can come in later on. So thank you. I must indicate that this is one of the major issues we saw with the program at the time in 2016, 2017. And like Justin indicated, what happened at this time still has effect on some of the students at the moment. So when the class cap was introduced, I can talk particularly about what we saw in Grand Bassa County. Grand Bassa is one of the relatively populated counties in Liberia. There was a school that was assigned to Bridge, and because of that class cap, a lot of the students were thrown away. So what happened? Some of the teachers who were also thrown away, because by the way, we must indicate here that it wasn't only teachers, students that were thrown away. Bridge was giving the leverage, according to the MOU they had in 2016, 2017, to move teachers to other schools, those that they thought were unfit to remain in their schools. So their MOU was very clear on that. So because of that, a lot of teachers were pushed into other schools. So for some of the teachers that could not make it, according to some tests that was given, they hurriedly set up some substandard structures to accommodate some of the students. And one of the schools at the moment is still in Grand Bassa. The person who set up that school is still struggling at the moment for resources to attend to those students. So yes, a lot of students were thrown away. We can particularly speak to the numbers at the moment in terms of the exact number of people who were thrown away. But what I can say is that the number was very huge, because there were schools that had up to 70 students. There were some that had up to 60. There were some that had 65. So you do the math for the schools that Bridge had at the time. I think 24 schools or so thereabout during our first year. So it's a whole lot. But the number does not, it matters, but it also does not really matter. Even if you have one person being thrown out, one child being thrown out of school, it is still a human rights violation. Leads to talk about hundreds of students. So that's what I can say to that. That what happened at the time still has effect on the students, because some of them ended up not going to school. And if we go back to check, we might realize that some of those who were thrown away might not have gone to school at all, even up to the moment. But that's something that we haven't established fully, so we can speak to it. I can give the floor to Justin to also maybe weigh in on it, since he has some of the data to speak to it.
No, I don't have a lot to add. That was great. I was curious to hear what you were going to say, Anderson, because I think all we can see in the data is to say, we can't explain the mechanisms very well. Yes, Bridge showing up at your school led to fewer children progressing to secondary school. I think it's quite consistent with that being due to the shutting down of the secondary school. I mean, I think the background there is clear, right? I want to emphasize this. There was an insistence at the time the program started that the schools in the program should not have secondary schools. They should just be primary schools, because the partners were supposed to run primary schools. Bridge really lobbied to get access to some of these bigger schools that had both primary and secondary on campus. The ministry conceded, and then they turned around and shut those down. So it wasn't that this sort of happened by accident, or in retrospect, we've learned our lesson. Like, this was a deliberate choice, and so I'm somewhat less forgiving of it, but I don't have much to add beyond that.
Thank you very much. So the second question, so we'll try and do one panelist for a question. Is the 50%, is the $50 in addition to the teacher's salary? How does government funding of these schools compare with public schools? So either Justin or Anderson can answer this question. So I'll read it again. Is the $50 in addition to the teacher's salary? How does government funding of these schools compare with public schools? From Bidemi Carroll.
I mean, I can answer briefly. I think this one's easy. At the start, I don't know the current budget numbers. At the start of the program, $50 was about what Liberia was spending per pupil in primary education, and which is mostly going to teacher salaries, right? And the Partnership Schools program was going to give another $50 per pupil on top of that. The government's still spending the money on the teacher salaries, and then there's an additional 50. So you're essentially doubling the expenditure per pupil. And at the time, the Ministry of Finance said, that's our goal. We want to get to $100 per pupil. And so this program is going to, for some schools, accelerate that move. That was the original vision. In practice, it's messier.
Thank you, Justin. And did pregnancy affect access to education, I guess? Were pregnant girls allowed to attend LEAP schools, and was this enforced for you, Anderson?
To the best of my recollection, no. I don't remember a situation, especially in the schools we visited, the bridge schools we visited, that we had pregnant students in school. I don't remember seeing that throughout the periods we visited those schools. 2016, 2017, 2018, up to present, when we did the research, we didn't see that.
Thank you, Anderson. Then a question to Justin from Maria. Given your findings in Liberia, how do you interpret the RCT study on BIA on Bridge International Academies in Kenya? If Justin can answer. Yeah.
So yeah, for everybody's benefit, obviously Bridge was one of the 8 operators in Liberia under partnership schools. Completely separate, there is an RCT study of Bridge's private schools in Kenya, run by a big team led by Michael Kramer, the recent Nobel Prize winner. And what they did in that study is hand out essentially vouchers or scholarships to students to go to a Bridge school for free. I think I'm emphasizing that because I think it's important to keep in mind the difference beyond one being Liberia, one being Kenya, obviously. In Liberia, Bridge comes in and takes over the management of a government school, right? The students are already there, the teachers are already there, and Bridge is going to bring in its approach to pedagogy with, reading from the tablet and its management. Kenya, they're running private schools with private school students who pay fees to go to that school. And then you invite some new scholarship students to come to this private school. So it's a very different model. Bridge controls the teachers, their pay, they have a lot more freedom and discretion to do what they want. They're not working within a public school system, they're running private schools. And so what the Kenya study finds, I hope I can do justice to some of my friends who are involved with that, they find quite big learning gains. It's hard to compare apples and apples on different tests in different countries, but I think it's fair to say, bigger learning gains in Kenya than we saw in Liberia. And I think it's a great study. It's very well done. And so I think we need to, think about what it means. The way I read it is, what is informative for policy is like, what does Bridge / New Globe want to do going forward? One is run private schools. If the question is, can they run private schools? I would look at the Kenyan study and look at those results. If the question is, can Bridge come in or New Globe come in a public-private partnership and help manage public schools, government school systems, then I think the Liberia experience is particularly relevant. And so what they mean kind of depends on what the policy question is.
Thank you, Justin. Then from Akiagle, From his understanding, does it mean that bridge schools were not monitored? That's the question.
I don't know if I can say something and Anderson can say more. I mean, in some ways, the evaluation we were running was part of that monitoring framework. Doing standardized tests of all the students and coming in and doing classroom observations. I think my impression is there wasn't a lot beyond that. The ministry didn't have a lot of budget and capacity to do a lot of, school visits to see what was going on beyond that. People can disagree, but my own view would be the reason things went south in some of these bridge schools is not so much that we didn't have data and information. There were even news stories, in the early months of partnership schools about children being expelled en masse. And the ministry knew it's because of the way the funding was structured, the ministry had little incentive or authority to do much to crack down on it. If you're being offered as a very underfunded ministry, financing from a private philanthropy to have this company run schools, you're not in much of a position to say no. So I think it's less about a lack of monitoring and more about that power dynamic.
Thank you, Justin. To Anderson, where was I?
Yeah.
I have a question. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
You wanted to jump on the same question that Justin addressed?
Yeah, so just quickly say that based on the engagements we've had, on paper it appears there's a lot of monitoring going on with the bridge school and the LEAP schools, but then in practice, you don't get to see much of that. Even from bridge itself, many of the schools we visited complained that they had not received the monitors from bridge that are supposed to visit them regularly. And there were also complaints that the times those monitors visited, issues that they reported, which was really concerned about their tablets, and the things that benefited them most than the issues that bordered on the welfare of the teachers. So some of the teachers would complain about not being on the payroll, not getting staffing or deduction of their staffing and all of that. Those things were not really addressed or not timely addressed from what we got from the teachers compared to some of the things that really bordered on the interests of BIA. So yes, it may appear that monitoring is going on, but in practice, not much is really happening on the side of bridge. But then also government is has not been really doing much in terms of monitoring of these schools across the entire public school system, not just the LEAP or the partnership schools.
Thank you very much, Anderson. I wanted to know, you can follow up on this. I also wanted to know, on behalf of Akia Gle, before the establishment of Bridge in Liberia, were there any assessment done that considered all the possible constraints that you highlighted in your research, Anderson?
Yeah, so before LEAP, we had a public school system, and we must indicate here that funding of education has been a challenge. Government has not really met the benchmark required for funding education at our level, the minimum 15 to 20%. We haven't done that. So there's been challenges at all levels, salary for teachers, resources for monitoring, procurement of educational supplies, and all of the different things. So these challenges have existed, but we haven't had a situation whereby there will be mass dismissal of students. As you may know, we have free and compulsory primary education program that was introduced by the then government, but then not much has been happening in terms of enforcement of that policy. So at the moment, even the public schools that are supposed to be free on a bridge are not as free as they have been portrayed. So parents are still paying fees. Government says those are registration fees that those students pay. They don't call it tuition, but even the bridge schools, in the bridge schools, people pay these fees. And when we visited also, it was something that came up that in some parents who had 2, 3 children could not afford to send all of them to school because they didn't have some of the fees to pay. So yes, there have been challenges in the system, but some of the issues that we raised or we're raising with the LEAP program are relatively new, or they're unique to the program. For example, the mass dismissal of people, or transfer of teachers from one location to another without resettlement package. So you have people moving from Montserrat County to maybe Maryland or to Riverside, Western Liberia, without adequate transportation and resettlement package. So these are things that have been happening. And I think part of the reasons why we're following this program up a lot is the fact that there's so much coming in terms of resources. I think a question was asked about how much government is spending on the traditional schools and how much these providers are getting. Justin talked about the $50 per pupil. When you do the math, the LEAP schools are getting much more resources. So we must say here that the teachers that are in the bridge schools are paid by government. They are government paid. So unlike the initial years where they recruited a lot of volunteer teachers and all of that, moving forward, the teachers have all been taken over by government, or they are being settled by government, except for a few volunteer teachers, that have not yet been enrolled onto the government payroll, that BIA may be compensating, or some of the other providers. But these teachers are paid by government. So all Bridge is doing is to have the infrastructure, take over the infrastructure, which they are supposed to do some renovation and all of that they've not been doing. But the main thing that they say they have to do is to use their technology, their tablets, and do the teaching and the monitoring. That which, from what we've seen, they have not done effectively, because the schools they have are practically no different from the traditional public schools, despite all the resources that they're getting that they have not fully accounted for.
Thank you, Anderson. And quickly, I'll mention 2 questions and you have to answer quickly. So to Justin, first, when you talk about centralized, from Tyler Hook, when you talk about centralized funding, do you mean Ministry of Education funding or the pooling of funds with the help of ARC and social finance? That's the first question from him. Then, these schools were supposed to be free. Was there evidence of PTA fees and other fees being captured by by teachers and HT during your research?
So on the second one, it's pretty easy. I mean, we did survey schools on what fees were being charged for ECE and for primary level. There are fees there. I can't say who's capturing them, but there were fees being collected in the control schools, and the program did reduce that, not quite to zero, but fee levels were low, and there was a significant reduction in fees due to the LEAP program. But on the funding mechanism, I think with the help of ARC, who was providing technical assistance to the ministry at the start of this program, there was this push to have donors who wanted to contribute put their money into a central pot, and then that would pay out the $50 subsidy per pupil to the operators. And so then you could kind of say that would give the government some central control of, if you perform well, maybe you get more. If you don't, we can kick you out, and there's other operators who could take over your schools. What ended up happening is, it became difficult to sustain that pooled fund. There was never Government of Liberia money in that pooled fund. That was donor money. But essentially, donors became more eager. A lot of donors just wanted to back, individual firms. And for the firms, it became a way of them being willing to spend out of their general fundraising to say, look, we can make this work in Liberia and see how great we're doing. So I think there wasn't enough commitment, from donors, I think, to that pooling of funds and giving, we're not talking about, again, Government of Liberia money, but putting the Government of Liberia in the driver's seat over that pooled fund so that they can control accountability of the program.
Thank you. And one question from Stephen Cleese. Stephen Cleese is a professor in the US at the University of Maryland, and he published a critique of the Center for Global Development's first year LEAP. And he has 2 comments and 1 question. First comment: after decades of research, private schools do know better than public schools. When they teach comparable students, so LEAP's premise makes no sense. Second comment: LEAP is the private sector's dream. Instead of having to compete for students, they get hired by a government and don't have to compete. My question for Justin: in my study, I argued that the learning gains had nothing to do with private management. PSL/LEAP schools did better because of simple things that government schools could easily do: longer school hours, smaller class sizes, selecting better trained teachers, more textbooks, and basic inputs, and most likely teaching to the test by emphasizing language and math instruction. Also, I'm working with 5 colleagues on a critique of the RCT Kenya study of Bridge, and we are finding again that the learning gains had nothing to do with Bridges, scripted lessons, or management. So what do you have to say in response to that, Justin?
Sure. And hi, Steve. So just for everybody's awareness, I think, Steve is in the small set of people who think our study was too kind to partnership schools and to LEAP. A lot of the criticism we get is from the other direction, saying that we're being too harsh. I think on the core question of like, did these schools produce larger learning gains because of private management or because of things that the government schools could have done with the same money? I think it's a good question, and I don't think it's definitively answered, right? I mean, I think I definitely agree. I disagree on some of the specific things that might have mattered, but I do agree that like being able to recruit and deploy the best teachers to these schools was a big part of this story from what we can see in the data. And that the LEAP school sort of got first pick of the new teacher training graduates and ended up better staffed as a result. And that mattered. It seems to, it's not experimental, but it seems to matter in the data. And so, yes, I mean, on some of these other things like getting, a longer school day and more instructional time, I fully believe that, there's something that government schools could and should do. The question is how to get there. And the LEAP premise was that you need private management to come make that happen. I definitely don't want to argue that's the only way to get there. So I think understanding this program, yeah, some of those are mechanisms, but could you replicate some of those mechanisms in public schools through a different institutional setup? Maybe so.
So, hello. Yeah, I think I can say something to that. That's a very good point. The Justin made, and the questions are in place. That's something that we also indicated in the first research. And I think it's important to note that the LEAP providers have been giving favorable treatment, especially British international economies. And we've indicated over time that uh, there's nothing extra that they're doing, that if the traditional public schools were exposed to some of the conditions that these providers have, especially British international economies, they probably would do much more than that. So to put things into perspective, let's say Bridge. All of the schools that Bridge was giving during the first year were schools that are accessible. Many of the traditional schools are in places that even if you have resources to access in terms of monitoring, it's difficult to do. So you just jump off the road and get to a Bridge school to get a document or get information on teachers and all of that. That is a condition that was very favorable to Bridge, and it is something that we must indicate. Then on top of that, the whole issue of displacing, small class size that he talked about, having fewer people to do it and all of that, it has an impact on, quality teaching and all the different things. Then if you also look at the fact that these schools are benefiting from extra resources. So they are all public schools and the teachers are being paid by government. But these providers like Bridge, they are getting extra resources, the $50 from the pool fund and the extra resources that they mobilize in addition to the support that is coming from government, other renovation work they're doing across these schools and all of that. So if you look at the package, especially so what these providers are benefiting is much more, so much so that if you were to spread that across the general or the public school system, you will get probably the same results or even more. So yes, I also believe strongly that there's nothing really extra that these people are doing. We know that if you have technology, for example, if you can scale it up, and use it across, it might help with monitoring and many of the other things. So there are schools in Liberia that are doing far better, doing much more on Liberian management, local management doing far better. If you look at YMCA, for example, the Liberia provider under the program, Justice report on the first year says that youth movement spend far less, but then they got almost the same result as Bridge that spend a lot more money. And along the way, nothing really has changed in terms of the results from youth movement that is practically depending on only the pool fund and is not getting extra resources from other sources. Only rising economies has been able to, along the way, provide some support to them, but they are practically funded through the $50 that is provided from the pool fund. And they are doing the same and perhaps better than Bridge. So, I mean, the point is very clear that nothing extra Bridge is doing here or the providers are doing. If resources were to come for the public school system and the leverage these providers have were to be scaled up across the system, we could get much more results than what we're even getting, or the marginal gains that these providers are making despite all the resources that they're getting that they have not accounted for over the period properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anderson, and that will bring us to the end of this roundtable discussion. I mean, we are very happy with the diversity of ideas, the richness of the debate. So just as a reminder, the reports that will stem from the research that was conducted by Anderson on behalf of COTAE is going to be published early next year, and we all hope that you join the dissemination efforts. We also hope that the lessons learned from this roundtable discussion will inspire other education actors, including civil society organizations, to conduct similar research and or carry out advocacy regarding public-private partnerships in education, because again, public education is not a commodity. It's supposed to be a public good. So this is what we have to keep in mind. And thank you so much, Justin, for accepting to be a panelist today. Thank you very much, Anderson, for your very informative contributions. And we are inviting you to follow us, GI-ESCR, on all our social media handles, and to be on the lookout for the reports that will be published early next year. And yeah, thank you so much. I'm very, it's a shame Veronica couldn't join, but of course, we'll send you a follow-up email with all the presentations, including Veronica's. And of course, all the questions that could not be addressed during this roundtable discussion, we are sure that they are going to be addressed in the full report that is going to be published early next year. Thank you so much, everyone, and I wish you a very lovely evening. So we are also going to stop recording and our live stream now.
Thank you, Aya. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.